In March 2024, antique dealer Rebecca Martinez was browsing through a estate sale in Bakersfield, California, when she stumbled upon a collection of old photographs tucked away in a dusty cardboard box. The elderly homeowner, whose grandmother had recently passed away, was selling decades of accumulated family memorabilia at bargain prices. Martinez specialized in vintage photography and had developed an expert eye for identifying valuable or historically significant images. Most of the photographs in the collection were typical family snapshots from the 1920s and 1930s, birthday parties, holiday gatherings, and everyday moments captured by amateur photographers during the early decades of consumer camera ownership. However, one photograph immediately caught Martinez's attention. It was a formal wedding portrait, professionally taken and mounted on heavy cardboard backing typical of commercial photography studios from the 1930s. The studio's embossed mark indicated it had been taken at Morrison's Portrait Studio, Fresno, California, with a date stamp showing June 15, 1932. The photograph depicted a young couple posed in the traditional wedding portrait style of the era. The bride, appearing to be in her early 20s, wore an elegant white dress with intricate beadwork and a long veil secured with orange blossoms. Her expression radiated joy and anticipation, with bright eyes and a genuine smile that conveyed the happiness expected of a new bride. The groom, also appearing to be in his 20s, wore a dark formal suit with a white boutonniere. The couple stood close together against a painted backdrop typical of professional portrait studios, with the bride's hand resting on the groom's arm in the conventional pose of the period. At first glance, the photograph appeared to be a typical Depression-era wedding portrait, a moment of celebration and hope captured during one of America's most challenging economic periods. Young couples throughout the country had continued marrying and building families despite widespread unemployment and financial hardship. However, as Martinez examined the photograph more closely under better lighting, she noticed something unusual about the groom's expression that would soon lead to an extraordinary discovery about identity, survival, and the lengths people went to reinvent themselves during the Great Depression. When Martinez brought the wedding photograph back to her shop and examined it under professional lighting equipment, what she discovered was deeply unsettling. While the bride's face displayed genuine happiness and excitement, the groom's expression told a completely different story. The groom's smile appeared forced and artificial, lacking the warmth and joy typically seen in wedding photographs. His eyes, rather than reflecting happiness or love, showed what appeared to be fear, anxiety, or even desperation. The contrast between his attempted smile and his genuinely distressed eyes created a disturbing disconnect that suggested this wedding photograph documented something far more complex than a simple celebration. Most unsettling was what appeared to be visible bruising around the groom's left eye and temple, skillfully concealed with makeup but still detectable under careful examination. The bruising suggested recent physical violence, raising questions about the circumstances surrounding this apparently happy occasion. Martinez also noticed that the groom's posture appeared tense and unnatural. While wedding photographs of the era typically showed couples standing close together in comfortable intimacy, this groom maintained a subtle distance from his bride, and his body language suggested reluctance or discomfort rather than affection. The bride, by contrast, appeared completely unaware of her new husband's distress. Her expression and body language conveyed genuine happiness and excitement, suggesting she was either unaware of the groom's condition or the circumstances that had caused his obvious anxiety. Martinez photographed the wedding portrait from multiple angles, using high-resolution equipment to capture every detail of the subject's expressions and physical condition. When she enlarged the images, the evidence of the groom's distress became even more apparent, along with additional details that suggested this wedding had taken place under highly unusual circumstances. The discovery prompted Martinez to begin researching the photograph's origins, leading her into an investigation that would reveal one of the most disturbing survival strategies employed during the Great Depression and change her understanding of how desperate people had adapted to economic catastrophe. Martinez contacted Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a historian at California State University who specialized in Great Depression social history and survival strategies. When Hernandez examined the wedding photograph, she immediately recognized signs that suggested the image documented a phenomenon that historians had long suspected but rarely been able to prove. This appears to show evidence of what we call survival marriage, Hernandez explained as she studied high-resolution images of the photograph. During the worst years of the Depression, some people entered marriages not for love, but as desperate survival strategies when other options had been exhausted. Hernandez's research had uncovered scattered evidence that the economic catastrophe of the 1930s had created circumstances where people sometimes agreed to marriages purely for economic security, housing, or protection from various threats. These arrangements were typically concealed from families and communities who expected marriages to be based on genuine affection and mutual choice. The evidence of physical violence visible in the groom's appearance suggested an even more disturbing possibility that he might have been coerced into the marriage through threats or actual violence. Such coercion was known to have occurred when people with resources targeted vulnerable individuals who had few alternatives for survival. Hernandez contacted colleagues at other universities who had researched Depression-era social survival strategies. The consensus that emerged suggested that the wedding photograph might document a case of economic coercion that represented one of the darkest aspects of how the Great Depression had affected vulnerable individuals. The investigation expanded to include researchers who specialized in analyzing photographic evidence of domestic violence and coercion. These experts confirmed that the groom's facial injuries and body language were consistent with patterns typically seen in cases of intimate partner violence or other forms of physical coercion. The photograph appeared to document a moment when someone had been forced into marriage against their will, possibly through violence or economic desperation so severe that they had no viable alternatives. The bride's apparent happiness suggested she might have been unaware of the coercive circumstances, believing she was entering a conventional loving marriage. The discovery would soon lead the research team into archives and records that would reveal the broader context of this disturbing wedding and the survival strategies that desperate people had employed during America's worst economic crisis. Dr. Hernandez's research team began investigating Depression-era records in Fresno County to understand the social and economic conditions that might have led to the circumstances documented in the wedding photograph. What they discovered painted a grim picture of desperation and exploitation during the worst years of American economic collapse. By 1932, Fresno County had experienced 3 years of devastating unemployment, farm foreclosures, and business failures. The agricultural economy that supported much of the region had collapsed as crop prices fell and major farms went bankrupt. Thousands of families had lost their homes, and transient camps filled with desperate people seeking any form of work or shelter. County records showed that reported cases of domestic violence, fraud, and exploitation had increased dramatically during this period. Law enforcement resources were severely limited, and many crimes went unreported or uninvestigated due to lack of personnel and community resources. The research team discovered that unscrupulous individuals had exploited the desperation of the period by targeting vulnerable people with offers of housing, employment, or security in exchange for various forms of servitude or compliance. Some of these arrangements had involved forced marriages designed to provide legal cover for exploitation. Marriage records from Fresno County in 1932 showed several unusual patterns. Many marriages involved significant age differences, unusual geographic origins of the parties, or other circumstances that suggested they might not have been conventional romantic unions. The legal protections available to married people during this period had made marriage an attractive tool for those seeking to establish control over vulnerable individuals. The team also found evidence that some people had used marriage as a strategy for obtaining housing, employment, or other resources during the economic crisis. While some of these arrangements were mutual agreements between consenting adults, others appeared to have involved varying degrees of coercion or deception. Most disturbingly, the research revealed that law enforcement and social services of the era had limited ability or willingness to investigate domestic violence or coercive marriage arrangements. The social stigma attached to divorce, combined with limited legal protections for victims of domestic violence, had created circumstances where people could be trapped in abusive situations with little recourse. The historical context suggested that the wedding photograph documented not an isolated incident, but rather one visible example of exploitation patterns that had become increasingly common during the worst years of the Great Depression. Using the studio marking and date information from the photograph, Martinez and Dr. Hernandez began searching Fresno County marriage records from June 1932 to identify the couple. After reviewing dozens of marriage licenses from that period, they discovered a record that matched the photograph's date and studio location. The marriage license identified the bride as Margaret Rose Thompson, age 22, daughter of local farming family that had managed to maintain their property despite economic hardships. The groom was listed as James Mitchell Anderson, age 24, with no local address and occupation, listed simply as laborer. Further investigation revealed that Margaret Thompson came from a family that had been relatively successful in maintaining their farm operations despite the agricultural crisis. Her father owned substantial property outside Fresno and had connections with local banks and business leaders who had helped him weather the economic storm. James Anderson's background proved much more difficult to trace. No previous records for him existed in Fresno County, and his listed place of birth in Oklahoma could not be verified through available documents. The lack of documentation suggested he might have been one of the thousands of transient workers who had traveled to California seeking employment during the Dust Bowl migration. The research team discovered that Margaret Thompson's family had reported concerns to local authorities about her sudden engagement to Anderson, whom she had known for less than 2 months before their wedding. Family letters from the period, preserved in local historical archives, expressed confusion and worry about Margaret's decision to marry someone they considered a stranger. Most revealing was a letter written by Margaret's sister to their cousin in Los Angeles, dated 2 weeks after the wedding. The letter expressed concern that Margaret seemed frightened of her new husband and had stopped communicating with her family after the marriage. The sister wrote, "Margaret barely speaks when James is present, and she seems afraid to leave the house without his permission." The evidence suggested that James Anderson had targeted Margaret Thompson because of her family's relative prosperity, and that he had used charm, deception, or potentially coercion to convince her to marry him. The wedding photograph appeared to have captured a moment when the reality of his intentions was becoming clear to him, even as Margaret remained unaware of the danger she faced. The investigation was revealing a case study in how economic desperation had created opportunities for predatory individuals to exploit vulnerable people during the Great Depression. As the research team delved deeper into James Anderson's background, they uncovered evidence suggesting he had used multiple identities and had possibly committed similar acts of deception in other locations. Working with historians at universities in Oklahoma, Texas, and Arizona, they began tracing reports of men matching Anderson's description who had targeted women from prosperous families during the early 1930s. The investigation revealed a pattern of calculated predatory behavior. In each case, a charming stranger had appeared in communities during times of economic stress, courted women from families with remaining resources, and convinced them to marry quickly before disappearing with whatever assets he could obtain. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a man matching Anderson's description had married a banker's daughter in 1931 before disappearing with her inheritance and jewelry. In Phoenix, Arizona, similar reports described a man who had convinced a ranch owner's widow to marry him before selling her property and vanishing with the proceeds. The research team contacted law enforcement historians who specialized in Depression-era crime patterns. They confirmed that such schemes had become increasingly common during the worst years of the economic crisis, as desperate people had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for exploiting others' vulnerability and trust. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting that Anderson had used violence or threats of violence to maintain control over his victims. In several cases, women who had initially been happy to marry the charming stranger had later been seen with injuries consistent with domestic violence. Some had attempted to contact family members for help, but had been prevented from doing so by their controlling husbands. The wedding photograph began to take on new meaning as the research team understood what they were seeing. The groom's expression reflected not wedding day nerves, but rather the psychological state of someone engaged in deliberate deception and potentially planning violence against his new wife. The bruising visible on Anderson's face suggested that He might have encountered resistance from Margaret or her family before the wedding, or that he had been involved in violent confrontations with previous victims or their families. His obvious anxiety reflected the stress of maintaining his deception while planning to exploit his new wife's trust and resources. The photograph documented a moment of predatory calculation disguised as matrimonial celebration, captured by a photographer who had unknowingly preserved evidence of one of the most disturbing survival strategies employed during America's worst economic crisis. The research team's most challenging task became determining what had happened to Margaret Thompson Anderson after her wedding. County records provided disturbing clues about the trajectory of her marriage and ultimate fate. Property records showed that within 6 months of the wedding, Margaret's family farm had been sold to pay what were described as urgent debts owed by James Anderson. The sale price was substantially below market value, suggesting either coercion or desperate circumstances that had forced a quick transaction. Local newspaper archives contained a brief report from December 1932 describing the accidental death of a young woman who had drowned in an irrigation canal outside Fresno. The victim was identified as Margaret Anderson, age 22, survived by her husband James. The report noted that she had apparently slipped while walking near the canal during a heavy rainstorm. However, the research team found evidence suggesting that Margaret's death had not been accidental. Correspondence between her sister and local authorities revealed that family members had requested investigation of the circumstances, expressing suspicion about the timing and location of Margaret's death. The family had noted that Margaret was an experienced swimmer who had grown up around irrigation systems and would have been unlikely to accidentally drown in familiar territory. They also pointed out that she had recently expressed fear of her husband and had attempted to contact them about returning home shortly before her death. Most significantly, the research team discovered that James Anderson had left Fresno immediately after Margaret's funeral, claiming he needed to find work in other areas. No forwarding address was left, and he had apparently taken all remaining proceeds from the farm sale with him. The pattern of behavior was consistent with the previous cases the team had identified. In each instance, Anderson appeared to have married women for their resources, used violence or intimidation to maintain control, and ultimately disposed of his victims when he had obtained what he wanted from them. The wedding photograph had documented not just a coercive marriage, but potentially the last images of a woman who had been systematically exploited and possibly murdered by a predator who had used the economic chaos of the Great Depression to target vulnerable victims. Margaret's story represented the extreme end of how economic desperation had created opportunities for predatory individuals to exploit and harm others during one of America's darkest economic periods. Working with law enforcement historians and genealogists, the research team expanded their investigation to trace James Anderson's activities across multiple states during the Depression era. What emerged was evidence of one of the most systematic predatory schemes of the period, involving at least 6 documented victims across 4 states. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Anderson would arrive in communities experiencing severe economic hardship, identify women from families with remaining resources, court them intensively for brief periods, convince them to marry quickly, gain access to their assets, and then either disappear or arrange for their deaths in ways that appeared accidental. In addition to Margaret Thompson, the research team documented cases involving Sarah Williams, 19, daughter of a surviving Oklahoma rancher. Married in 1931 and dead within 8 months from what was recorded as a riding accident. Helen Rodriguez, 26, widow of a successful Arizona merchant. Married in 1933 and found dead from apparent food poisoning after her business was sold. Elizabeth Chen, 23, daughter of California vineyard owners. Married in 1934 and killed in what appeared to be a house fire that destroyed evidence of property transfers. Each case followed the same pattern of rapid courtship, marriage, asset transfer, and victim death under circumstances that appeared accidental but raised suspicions among family members. Local authorities, overwhelmed by economic crisis and lacking resources for thorough investigations, had generally accepted the deaths as tragic accidents. The research team found evidence that Anderson had used different names and backstories in each location, but physical descriptions, behavioral patterns, and timing of events confirmed they were investigating a single perpetrator. The wedding, photographed from Fresno, provided the clearest visual evidence of his identity and methods. Most chilling was the discovery that Anderson's scheme had been carefully planned and executed. He appeared to have researched target communities in advance, identifying families with vulnerable unmarried women and remaining assets. His courtships were precisely calculated to exploit the victim's emotional needs and economic anxieties. The research revealed that Anderson had successfully murdered at least 6 women and had stolen resources equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in current value. His use of marriage as a cover for systematic murder represented one of the most sophisticated predatory schemes of the Depression era. The wedding photograph had preserved evidence of a serial killer who had used the economic chaos and social disruption of the Great Depression to prey upon vulnerable women with remarkable effectiveness and apparent impunity. The research team's investigation revealed the tragic extent to which economic chaos and overwhelmed institutions had enabled Anderson's predatory behavior to continue unchecked. In each location where he had operated, local authorities had been too overwhelmed by economic crisis to conduct thorough investigations of suspicious deaths. The team found evidence that family members in multiple cases had attempted to raise concerns about the circumstances of their daughters' deaths, but these concerns had been dismissed or inadequately investigated. Limited law enforcement resources, social stigma around domestic violence, and the legal protections afforded to husbands had created an environment where Anderson could operate with minimal risk of detection. Most frustrating was evidence that Anderson's pattern might have been recognized and stopped if authorities in different states had been able to communicate effectively. Several law enforcement officials had noted suspicious patterns in their jurisdictions, but lack of coordination between agencies had prevented them from identifying the broader scheme. The research team found traces of Anderson's activities continuing into the late 1930s, suggesting that he had continued his predatory behavior for at least 8 years. The full extent of his crimes might never be known, as many suspicious deaths from the period were poorly documented or investigated. The trail went cold in 1939, with no definitive evidence of what ultimately happened to James Anderson. He might have been killed by family members of victims who took justice into their own hands, died in military service during World War II, or simply changed his methods as economic conditions improved and his original strategy became less viable. The unsettling wedding photograph represented the only clear documentation of Anderson's identity and methods that had survived. Without this accidental preservation of evidence, his crimes might have remained completely unknown to history. The investigation had revealed not just the story of a serial predator, but also the broader social failures that had enabled his behavior. The economic crisis had created circumstances where vulnerable people could be exploited and killed with minimal risk of detection or punishment. The research team's findings would contribute to historical understanding of how social and economic chaos could create opportunities for predatory behavior, and the importance of maintaining effective institutions for protecting vulnerable populations during times of crisis. 3 years after Rebecca Martinez first noticed the disturbing expression in the 1932 wedding photograph, the discovery has led to one of the most significant investigations of Depression-era crime and a long overdue recognition of victims whose stories had been forgotten by history. The photograph now serves as the centerpiece of an exhibition at the Museum of Social History in Los Angeles, titled Hidden Victims: Violence and Exploitation During the Great Depression. The exhibition honors Margaret Thompson Anderson and the other women who were killed by James Anderson, presenting their stories as part of the broader history of how economic crisis had created opportunities for predatory behavior. Dr. Hernandez published a comprehensive academic study documenting Anderson's crimes and their historical context, which has become required reading in courses on Depression-era social history. The research has prompted new investigation of other suspicious deaths from the period, and has contributed to better understanding of how economic chaos can enable predatory behavior. The surviving family members of Anderson's victims have found some measure of closure in finally understanding what happened to their relatives. Margaret Thompson Anderson's great-niece attended the museum exhibition opening, saying, For 90 years, our family wondered why Margaret changed so dramatically after her marriage and what really caused her death. Finally, knowing the truth is painful, but it honors her memory. The discovery has also prompted new research into Depression-era domestic violence and exploitation, revealing patterns that had previously been hidden or misunderstood. Social historians have begun identifying other cases where economic desperation had created circumstances that enabled systematic abuse and murder. For Martinez, the investigation changed her perspective on the responsibility that comes with discovering historical evidence. She has donated the original photograph to the museum and has funded ongoing research into identifying other potential victims of similar crimes. The wedding photograph serves as a powerful reminder that images can preserve evidence of historical injustices long after the circumstances that enabled them have been forgotten. What appeared to be a simple wedding portrait actually documented a moment of calculated predatory behavior that cost multiple women their lives. As visitors study the photograph today, they can see beyond the bride's happiness to recognize the fear and desperation in the groom's expression, evidence of the dark reality hiding behind a facade of matrimonial celebration. The image reminds us that even during society's most difficult periods, we must remain vigilant about protecting the most vulnerable members of our communities. The story of Margaret Thompson Anderson and the other victims represents both a tragedy of individual lives lost and a broader lesson about the importance of maintaining social institutions and support systems that can protect people from exploitation during times of crisis. The sweet wedding portrait that concealed such a disturbing truth serves as a lasting memorial to women whose courage and suffering had been hidden from history until one antique dealer looked closely enough to notice something was terribly wrong.